Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with another episode of Esports Samaritans. I've got here some veterans of the NA Pro scene to talk about the path to pro within NACS LUL. Here we have Nohte, writer for HLTV and Dust2 US, recently appeared in a talk show with Launders to talk about something akin to what we're going to talk about today. So he's well versed on the subject matter, I'm sure. We've got Vu in the bottom right-hand corner of the overlay, longtime content creator and broadcast talent, obviously also coached at the semi-pro level for NACS as well. So he's got his experience to bring to the table. And below me, we've got DAVEY, who's a very famous NA competitor, played at a major, and of course, he currently lords over NA's up-and-coming talent on the Mythic roster, which is, of course, the place where all great NA players go to luxuriously bathe in the incoming adoration of their fans. So I wanted to get everybody's opinion at first on the state of the current path to pro that we have. And for me, I think the best way to do that would be to first, especially for people who are coming in and are not aware of what things were historically, I want to talk a little bit about what it used to be like, and from all of your guys' perspectives and experiences. And then from there, I think we can jump into what it currently is, like essentially what's different now compared to then. And there's going to be a lot of things there. But to start things off, I wanted to ask DAVEY. Of course, anybody can jump in on this. You've all been on my shows before. You know they're pretty loose. So I wanted to ask you, DAVEY, first, though. In Splyce and Spacestation, back in those days, if you can remember back that far anyway, I wanted to ask if you saw, when you were picking up people for the roster, when you were scouting people, or just when you remember the stories of your colleagues talking about their path to getting onto a pro team, did it strike you, the path to pro, that is, as being significantly easier or significantly more consistent than it is currently? And if so, can you just sort of elaborate on what the differences are between then and now?
Sure. I think in the Splyce and Spacestation days, it wasn't easy to get to Pro League. The MDL was super competitive. Pro League was super competitive. It wasn't easy at all to get into Pro League. And it was for upcoming players also, it wasn't easy for them to get onto pro teams. Even high-level MDL teams were practically pro teams. Like I remember there was one season where I wasn't on Splyce at the time, but where MDL had E United, Splyce, I think one of the Brazilian teams in MDL, like MDL had like
Luminosity.
Luminosity, right? Sorry, yeah. So they had like 3 or 4 pro teams in MDL that season competing for 2 pro league spots. So back then it was really difficult to get into pro league, but that was right after the sort of big investor boom of early 2016 happened. So there was a ton of investor money just in Counter-Strike, just sitting around. So people were willing to pay pro level salaries for MDL teams. That at the time that was commonplace. We had been spoiled a little bit by all the investment money that had been pumped into esports in 2016. That also coincided with the crazy inflation of salaries, right? With Immortals coming into the scene and all the other orgs having to take on investment to compete with that. So so back then it was pretty difficult to get into Pro League. I think if you go back earlier, like 2014, sort of, when I was playing with at the time we would have been Affinity and potentially Method, Threes Up those days. Back then it's pretty much how it is now, where if you're a top team in MDL, back then there wasn't even a division that was MDL. It was open, intermediate, main, and then Pro League, like Invite at the time.
There was Premier, right?
Not yet.
No?
So not yet. There wasn't yet. So I played in the first season of Premier. Like the very first season of Premier, I played in that with Mobility Gaming. Ended up becoming Affinity. But so back then, if you won main or even finished top 2 or 3 in main, there was a decent chance you got invited to Invite, because that's what it was. It was the Invite League. Like winning main didn't even guarantee you a spot in Invite. It just meant that you were the most likely to get the invite. So back then it was it was a little bit different, because there wasn't people getting paid at all. Even once you're in the Invite League, you weren't getting paid. So becoming a professional player had a bit of a different definition. But overall, I think that way back then, generally speaking, you could actually like build a team, go through the leagues, and then qualify to Invite if your team was good enough, because that's literally what my team did. We started in open, went to intermediate, went to Premier, finished I think second place in Premier, and qualified for Pro League. So we literally went on that path from open straight to Invite. So yeah.
And do you think that currently the scene right now, like that path all the way up to Pro League, has just more or less broken down? Is it because maybe the teams that are at the top have consolidated up there and just there hasn't been much variance towards the bottom end? I mean, obviously there was the famous example of ESL just kicking a bunch of teams out, but aside from even that example.
I want to ask one thing, like, what are we defining pro here, right? Because Davey's saying, there was a lot of investor money in 2016 or whatever.
Yes.
And there was pro teams in MDL. So they'd be in a semi-pro league, but they're, a salaried professional team. You'd call them professional. Right so now, right? I'm not sure what we're defining as pro here.
Yeah, I would say
league, or
I would just say professional player means that you get paid enough to live off of sustainably while just playing. Which obviously that varies depending on who you are, though, obviously. Because you could be a kid who doesn't have that many bills, who only needs maybe an MDL salary or lower, an average MDL salary in order to get by. And maybe even that just goes to spending money. Whereas if you're just an adult, if you're Pwn alone or somebody, you got bills to pay, then that's obviously very different.
I think generally MDL is a semi-pro league, but you can have, because of the nature of what relegation is, you can have professional teams playing in a semi-pro league, right? Because that's what promotion relegation is. I know for a lot of Americans that concept isn't something most Americans aren't familiar with it, given how sports work in America. But it's fairly common in a lot of European sports where a professional team will get relegated down to a semi-pro division. All of the players playing on that team are still professional players making professional salaries on a legally professional team. But now they're playing in a semi-pro division and have to then requalify for the professional division again. So I think back then, most of the top MDL teams were professional teams. They were teams who were playing in potentially the Facets equivalent of the Pro League. They were playing in professional tournaments. Like a lot of the teams like Luminosity were like going to like DreamHack events and placing in the top 3, top 4s, but They were playing in MDL. So back then it was a little bit different. I think that the lines weren't so clearly defined as they are now. Whereas back then, because of how many professional teams were playing in semi-pro divisions, even in Europe right now, there's plenty of professional teams playing in MDL, right? Like Sprout, Endpoint, who are all making legitimate professional salaries, but playing in the MDL league. So it just sort of depends on which stage you're at, which stage the league is at and its time frame, I guess.
Also, just to touch on your point of like the promotional structure, Pranogo, like back then, the top 2 teams in MDL would play a final, and the winner would automatically get promotion to Pro League. One team would get auto-relegated from Pro League, and then the next 2 teams would also play to fight for their spots from the second and third place teams in Pro League.
Yeah, it's the LCS relegation system from like season 3 or something for League, probably, is what it sounds like.
There is always the ability for teams to move up if they were good enough, though. Right now, that doesn't really exist.
Okay. Can you walk us through what the process right now is? Just
really quick, I just want to add to that point. It was never actually a guarantee if you win that promotion match that you get promoted to Pro League. ESL always had the right to choose if they wanted to give that team a license or not. It was never 100% guaranteed.
Isn't this what happened with the drama with Kusta's team and Ryu's team?
So what happened with Whitmer's team as well?
They were supposed to get promoted, and they were like, haha, by the way, you're not getting promoted.
Yeah, because they had a certain amount of spots, so they would want to invite bigger orgs into their leagues because it would generate more income for the league, which from a business standpoint makes sense. It just sucks for players that thought they were getting Pro League spots.
Yeah. So yeah, the current promotional structure is a little bit different right now just because of COVID. They made it so that the winner of MDL did get a spot in Pro League, but their intention with cutting down leagues from 48 to 24 teams is that the top 3 teams in MDL from North America, the top 3 in Europe, the top team in Asia, and the top team in Oceania would all go to a global challenge LAN. And then the top 2 teams from that global challenge LAN would then qualify for ESL Pro League. Like you would have to not just win your division of MDL, you would have to place top 2 at that global challenge LAN to qualify for EPL. And then you only get to keep that spot for 1 season. Unless you make it to the ESL Pro League LAN finals, at which point you're guaranteed an invite back, I believe it is. I don't think you have to place like top 6 or whatever at that LAN. I think if you make it to the LAN finals for EPL, then you get an invite back. And then the only other ways to make it back is being high on the ESL world rankings or winning MDL again, basically. Those are like the paths that they've now set up with the changes to Global Challenge and to EPL.
Yeah, the rankings to me seem particularly puzzling, and I guess, for lack of a better term, it might even be considered problematic that the person deciding who gets the licenses to come into Pro League or maintain their spot in Pro League is also the one designing the rankings. I'm not entirely sure if ESL has released like a guiding principle documentation of what informs their ranking, like how many points you get, or like how they weight essential points that come in. Obviously, like HLTVs is relatively public as far as I understand by comparison. But I assume that's just another case where, like, what I'm sort of building up to with the analysis of the ranking is the idea that ESL themselves have more or less been painted as a bad guy in the hearts and minds of a lot of people who are currently looking in a forlorn manner at the current state of NACS. So, like, obviously ESL is responsible, and through their like ESEA and MDL and all these other leagues and tournaments, they're responsible for a good portion of the North American side circuit. So is there a particular case that springs to anybody's mind here? What might be the cause of some issues that they were having, or why some people might hold them in sort of disrepute?
Well, I mean, obviously the fact that they cut down ESL Pro League, they cut it in half, but I think the bigger issue is the lack of communication around that. It's not the fact that they just did it, it's the fact they did it and none of the teams knew it was coming,
right?
Except for the partner teams that were part of that agreement. Like, the fact that the CSPPA knew it was happening and none of the players got a heads up, like 150 players effectively had their jobs taken away within like a month, that's one of the primary issues in that sense. But there was also like no structure in place either afterwards or planned to get put in place to make up for those slots that were lost. Like, it was to the point where I think a month after the league slots were cut down, ESL announced that they were going to do qualifiers in Europe and in North America to make up for the change to allow like certain teams to qualify for the league again. So there was like, it was really strange in the way they did it. And then also there was no like system they had set up to take over for the gap that they made in North America. And when you do that, you're just going to shatter that part of the scene.
I think there's a problem with just how reliant the NA scene has been on ESEA and ESL for a long time, in that, like, you know, the way they did it wasn't great, all that, but if it wasn't like, well, how do you go pro in NA? Well, you win MDL and you get into Pro League. Like, that's the path to pro, right? Especially with Face It kind of moving over with Flashpoint and all that. It's like all of our hopes and dreams were with ESEA, ESL, and then they just like, they're like, by the way, peace out, and you're kind of just left with your dick in your hands.
Do you agree with this sort of assessment, Davey?
Definitely, you know, to a certain extent. I think the one thing that I brought up earlier that is never addressed when talking about this is that what happened in 2016 and 2017 with all the crazy investment that came into esports with no real plan and nothing. Like, if we're talking about no plans and no communication, that would, angel investor groups just dumping $50 million into an org is one of those things that caused crazy overinflated salaries and way more pro teams than the scene could actually sustainably handle. So the problem is we were spoiled for so many years that then that is what became the norm. Like, it became normal to have a whatever 12, 14 team pro league in North America with 12 to 14 professional teams and also 4 to 5 professional teams playing in MDL competing for those other pro league spots. So when you have 20 professional teams in a scene where maybe one of those teams is actually profitable, then all of a sudden it becomes this whole thing where, well, nothing's profitable. So from ESL's standpoint, I'm not disagreeing. Like, even when I'm arguing with people about CSPPA on Twitter, I'm not disagreeing why ESL had to cut down Pro League. It obviously wasn't a sustainable product because there's way too many professional teams. They have to, people don't know this, they have to pay those teams like stipends to be in the league. Like, those teams make money by being in ESL Pro League. So how are they supposed to pay this many teams 6 figures, every single team, every season, 2 seasons a year? It's not sustainable. And I totally understand that from ESL's perspective. But like you guys were talking about, what was fucked was that it happened like that on a dime. A whole bunch of people lost their jobs, whole bunch of people lost their income, teams lost their spots, orgs who had made business plans, who had set up sponsorships based around the fact that they were in ESL Pro League. Now the next day they're not in ESL Pro League anymore. Sponsors pull on them. Now the people who are working at the orgs, they get fired, players get, you know what I mean? It's all of a sudden, so it wasn't like Note said, it wasn't so much the act of what happened, it was the way in which it was done that was a problem. But in North America, I think it's too not really a nice way to say it. I think it's too simple to just be like, oh, ESL fucked NACS. Like, no, like all the crazy and like it goes back a lot farther than that. It goes back a lot farther than that. It was all the crazy investment, all the people in NACS who became super spoiled because of that, became entitled because of that, and then all of a sudden we have it so good for so long with no profit, and everyone just is like, well, this is just going to keep going, right? No, it's not going to keep going. Actually, this was the cutoff point. ESL set that cutoff point without telling anybody and then cut everybody off. So I was like, yes, that was a terrible way to handle it, but it was a long time coming. Like it wasn't shocking. We saw orgs pulling out way before ESL had done that. Orgs were pulling out way before that. So yeah, it was not great. Not great overall.
Do you think the reason why so many orgs were pulling out even before this ESL cut and before recently as well? I assume that sustainability is the word on everybody's lips when they're leaving Counter-Strike. But a big part of that has to be to what Davey said here about the sheer number of pro teams or professional league salaried teams and the salaries themselves being essentially out of control, out of whack for the level of play that they were getting or for the exposure that the orgs and sponsors were getting through these players who oftentimes didn't do media or didn't have a huge following, didn't have a huge personal brand. So I mean, again, this is another question for pretty much anybody here, but like just how like disproportionate, and numbers don't necessarily need to be leaked here, obviously, but how disproportionate were the salaries themselves? Like at this point, people have said that pro salaries were way too high, but like, is this an order of magnitude of like double or triple what the actual value should have been in your guys' estimation? What do you guys think?
Well, I'm willing to talk about mine. I'm not going to talk about any other players, but I've been pretty open about the salaries I was making when I was playing professionally. So I know back in 2016 when we signed for Splyce, we signed on $3,000 a month. At the time, that was a average to slightly above average pro salary, I think. I think at the time, rumors were at the time that Cloud9 was making around 4 to 4.5K. And that was about the difference. Like it wasn't like it is now where you have some pro teams making 5K and some making 30K. You know what I mean?
Quick
Like
question, Davey. Is this while you were in MDL or in Pro League?
Pro League. So this is when we were with Threes Up. We were making $1,000 a month. Then I left to go to Method. The Threes Up guys got a bump to, I think, like 1.5 or 2K. And I was at Method still making 1K. And then Splyce bought me from Method for like 2,000 euros or something. And then I went back to Splyce, and then our salaries were 3,000 USD a month during that time. And then I remember we qualified for the major, which was a pretty big deal. So, we started talking about salary bumps. We got bonuses and stuff. It was pretty nice. And then I want to say, whenever DreamHack Austin was that year, it might have been May, it might have been April, I'm not sure. But the CEO of Immortals, Noah Winston, he approached Marty, the owner of Splyce, and said, I want to buy Davey and Arya. Can you set up a meeting? Yada, yada, yada. So we set up a meeting at DreamHack Austin, and we talked to him, and he had offered us at that time $8,000 a month plus full dental and healthcare benefits to live in California, and they would pay for our house and stuff. And so me and Arya are looking at each other like, holy shit, that's pretty fucking massive, right? And at the time, that would have been like, that was super high for the time. I think NRG might have been making around like 5K a month. Cloud9 was still making around 5K a month at the time. So he was offering me and Arya $8,000 a month.
That's right? High even now, man. Like Floppy's making 10K a month on Cloud9 or something like that. Like roughly along those lines. Like that's high even now. So
yeah. So that was 2016. So then after that, I renegotiated with Splyce because Marty was like, look, I'll sell you if you want to leave, but I really want you to stay. So I was like, okay. So I renegotiated with him, and then I was making 5.5K a month with potential 1,500 in bonuses if I met certain media and social media and streaming numbers. I could get up to 7K a month if I hit all of the targets, which I rarely did, to be fair, but I was usually pretty close. So yeah, that was how much I was making back then. And at the time, that was one of the highest salaries in North America, if not the highest, which was ridiculous. But it was only because of the fact that someone with a crazy investment group comes in and offers way more than anybody else can reasonably match.
Yeah, there was no plan to make that back, pretty much. That was just, I've got money to burn, is what it sounds like anyway.
Right. So hearing the numbers like really puts into perspective, because I've heard like Thorin and Richarders talk about this salary inflation that came in, but it's really hard to quantify without actually hearing like just how ridiculously inflated it got that quickly.
Yeah.
Especially just for where you guys were. Also, like as a separate note, a lot of these teams just brought on players and then they just gave them full control of the roster. Like, it's just not a viable strategy. You need like a general manager to actually take care of that team, to actually like handle the player cuts and the proper roster transactions and changes. Like, you can't just pay a team $8,000 a player or whatever, like $5,000, $3,000 a player, without having like some oversight on like what's happening in the team and actually forcing the players to keep their shit together. Like, you need somebody there, and that doesn't even exist now in some teams. So like, that's the main transition we're seeing for some other organizations right now, but that just didn't exist back then.
Well, player organizations or players themselves within these organizations, rather, they have a storied history. I mean, Splyce, there's been some stories told on Peaker's Advantage episodes from DAVEY himself about some of the escapades that happened there. One of the things that this makes me think of, though, is the current state where a lot of these organizations, a lot of these teams don't actually have significant sponsorship organizations behind them. So they're usually are player run in that respect, or maybe they have a coach who deals with some of the management side of things and they're sort of wearing multiple hats. From my interview with Vu, there was some conversation about real gamer hours and other things that players got up to as a result of not necessarily having somebody who is always the lieutenant barking orders at them or sergeant barking orders at them every time that they needed to get onto a game. Is this an area where you think there's still a lot of room for improvement, especially in this homegrown area, Vu? Do you think that the whole North American player mentality thing is significantly different than European player mentalities from what you've seen, or just even in a vacuum? I don't know what you have to say about this, because obviously you've got some experience.
I think NACS, I think we're like, there's a bunch of different segments of things wrong with NACS, and we're kind of just rolling through whichever ones we think. Yeah. I think like, there is a definite problem with players picking up players. Players just pick up, oh, this guy fucked me last week in the server. He's like amazing in scrims. Like, every time we play, he runs around, he fucking one-shots me, right? Oh, we want to pick this guy up, the IGL's not fragging. We got to cut this guy, our secondary IGL. He seems to always have a great plan, when he's calling. So we'll just stick him as the IGL. And when you have players deciding roster moves, they don't make long-term focused roster moves. And I think that heavily impacts move ups for very good players. Players like Grim, might lounge around in MDL for far too long because players don't want to pick up an unproven player. That's something an org might do. That's something a coach might see promise in that player. That's something a manager might do. But players, in my experience, maybe Davey has a different experience, but from what I've seen with players, they don't like picking up people they don't know, they don't have experience with, they don't trust. And then you have troubles with move ups, and when you have troubles with move ups, then you have troubles with, other parts of the scene as well.
But it comes back to like not having anyone independent able to verify these moves or like make those decisions. Because like when I interviewed people to talk about Grim when he joined Liquid, every single player I talked to who'd played with him said that he always had that sort of ability, that multi-kill ability, the talent, the comms, like the attitude. He always had that. And when you don't have people properly scouting for these players and actually independently like going and verifying, watching demos, talking to their former teammates, like that's all stuff that management would do. It's not something that the players would do. It's like they heavily base it off their like personal interactions with some of these players. They heavily base it off of like playing them in scrims or matches or FPL, which is just like not a good method to build your roster. It just is not sustainable either.
I think that if anybody, I'm not sure who you talked to or what, but I think that people who, if anybody was saying that like Grim always had the comms and the attitude, I think that they were lying to you.
This is following Space Station, sorry.
Oh, following Space Station.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great, perfect. Yeah, no, that does make a lot more sense, because when I when I started playing with that Space Station team, I will say, like, the one thing that Grim always had problems with, and he'll admit this himself to this day. What he had problems with is he would get really in his own head. Like, he would get like really emo if he was having a bad game. He would get like really hard on himself. Like, he was super hard on himself, and it would make him play worse. Like, if he was having a bad game, he would start getting, his comms would get worse. He would start to play worse. All these things. And so that was one thing that we really had to work on a lot with him. And he got like way better at it. And one thing he always had was the skill. That was never in any doubt. He was insane. But like the one thing that he really had to develop, because he played on teams with people who were his friends forever, right? So when you play on teams, if you're lucky enough to play on a team with people who are all your friends for such a long time, the comms sort of come naturally. Like, people, like, you can say things and your friends recognize what you're saying, even if it's not necessarily super specific, right? So and maybe they'll understand your mannerisms more because you're friends with them. So you can get away with not necessarily communicating as much, or not communicating the right things. Or when you're having a bad day, your friends can just be like, oh, it's just Mike having a bad day. It's fine, move on. Like, cause they're so familiar. So what, that was one thing that I'm sure has helped him a lot, is actually eventually sort of not playing with the same group of people anymore. On Space Station, we brought in new people. Like, we had the only person from their like original friend group he was still playing with was Snakes, right? So I think that having new people to play with consistently, and then eventually going to Triumph, where again he's playing with like a bunch of new people, some people the same, some people new, and I bet that helped develop his, it made him into probably more of an actual leader in the server, more so than he realized, I think, because you have to take more control over what you're doing when you're playing with people who don't naturally flow off of you as well.
Another sort of connection here I'm drawing between, or I guess a difference that I'm contrasting here between NA and EU, since those are the two often compared regions anyway, is that there's a lot of stories with specific regional scenes in Europe where they'll have a lot of IGLs that you go through. Obviously, Denmark is famous for this, where back when Hundred was IGLing, you went through him. You might go through Snappy or Asilian. You might also go through Glaive even, or Kerrigan back in the day. There's a ton of different IGLs that you might sort of work your way up through the ranks of, like, third tier, second tier, all the way up to first tier if you're good enough. And that sort of establishes some sort of structure. I think another comparison that I often hear, and this isn't necessarily Europe specific, is team sports, where you might be playing some soccer or baseball, football for us non-Americans. You might be playing some of these sports where you actually have a coach from the early stages, and you get the team structure idea instilled within you without necessarily thinking it's all about me, I'm the star player, or which is something that I hear often complained about within the NA circles. So turning it back around onto you, Davey, I'm curious as to your thoughts on how players find their roles and find an understanding of sort of team structure within the current NACS landscape. Does that even happen? Like, is it something where that's always going to be a deficiency, or for a long time you think will be a deficiency? Or do you think that in its own kind of way, North America finds a way to instill these virtues or these values within their up and coming talent?
It's a good question. I think that the way that it's pretty much always happened in North America is the way it's going to continue happening, which is that you have like groups of friends who are good enough to climb up in the leagues. And then once they realize they need to sort of upgrade players, they just start picking off the best players from teams who they've played against in the league. So you keep a core group of like 2 or 3 guys that play together up through the leagues. And then as they get better and better, they're like, okay, weakest link gone, grab some nuts fragger from some other team. And then those players kind of end up becoming like the fraggers sort of thing. And usually it's like an IGL, a support player, and then like maybe like a lurk rifler. And they're like, okay, pick up this crazy entry fragger. Okay, pick up this opper who shit on us in scrims, like Vu was talking about earlier, right? And they just grab whoever the best player they've played against recently is. And I'm not, I will be honest, this is a better question for Vu because I'm not super familiar with even like, like I know you were coaching a advanced team. And I'm not super familiar with how sort of advanced teams go about making roster changes or how roles are sort of determined and stuff like that. But I know at least in, for MDL, that was one thing that obviously it's the, people make the meme like Ocean is NA Hunden, right? And like that's always been a meme forever. But one thing that going back years ago, what everyone in the pro scene, the reason why everyone in the pro scene always had respect for Ocean, even though he was a terrible player, was because no matter what, if you were a young player and you played on an Ocean team, you did actually learn what it was like to play real CS. No matter what, you learned these are roles. These are how you help your teammates. These are strategies. This is how you default. This is, you know what I mean? You actually learned a lot of the basic fundamentals of pro CS, which is why those players, if you came from an Ocean team and then jumped to a pro team without even realizing it, a lot of the times, those players, like without them even realizing it, I mean, they were more ready for pro CS than other players that came from semi-pro teams because of just the basic fundamentals they had learned just from playing for even a couple months with an Ocean team.
What do you think, Vu? How's Advanced compared to that?
Well, we were kind of a unique situation in Advanced. We were salarying players in Advanced for pretty decent money, I guess. I mean, you're not getting salaried in Advanced. You're not even getting teams salaried in MDL, right? So we were kind of being salaried by a all-star professional poker player is a bit of a unique situation, and we were very specific about how we were picking people up. We were going in looking for like very specific players, very specific situations, and
Mute your mic note.
Making sure they were not only going to fit the role, but also were the right personality, weren't going to be a problem, which is unbelievably hard. Like, you would not expect, you're like, I'm going to pay you $2,500 a month to win Advanced or potentially play MDL next season. You just have to be a decent player, like a good player, and not have personality issues. And it's like, there are 5 people that are at that level. It's like, what is going on here? I think one thing actually that people don't talk about a lot that I wanted to mention is, I think, what are they called? Academy teams. I think actually academy teams would have been something that maybe could have helped NA a little bit, but never really got going, because I think around the same time academy teams were like becoming the norm, or not even becoming the norm, but getting talked about. It was like Valve was, no, it's not happening. We're not doing academy teams. It's not going to happen. I think that would be one of the things that would actually make a big difference in NA specifically, because these players, like Davey said, they're not quite ready for the pro scene. If they haven't played with the right IGL, they're not ready, but they've got talent. They have a future, but how do you bridge that gap when you've got, MDL kind of just looking like it is now, which is, from what I've seen, players getting cut over Steam, even in MDL, players not talking to each other, like just very Bush League stuff going on.
Well, that's no specialty right there. Players not talking to each other, players going to twit longer, or just Twitter replies as their way to announce roster moves and stuff like that. Obviously, this is something I see you popping off all the time on Twitter Note. So I want you to take us away on this particular subject. How's this shaped up over the years? Is this something that you're just paying more attention to now, and it's always been like this? Or is this something where it's like intensified recently? What's your take?
In terms of like player moves and the way they're announcing it?
Yeah. Well, just the way that players conduct themselves within these rosters, and, sort of like what Vu was sort of talking about there, where the Bush League side of things.
I think it's just generally always been an issue. Like, some players are infinitely better at it than others, so I don't want to encompass it all into like one bunch, but there are like a handful of players who are very good at communicating and actually like put a legitimate effort into like announcing their moves or talking to us, or replying to us if we ask them for information. But the majority of the time, there's like, it's like the players will have their little conversations in TeamSpeak and like bicker with each other and have their little closed door conversations, and then they'll like tell us something completely different, and then they'll come back and tell us something different after the article gets published. So like it's just really strange in the flow of it. And also, like, I've been working for Dust 2 US for 3 years, right? And the evolution in seeing like the interaction on the website is also like the fact that we have to push so hard to get players to interact on a site that is dedicated to covering them is a little bit screwed up in my eyes. Like, it's not that we inherently deserve to get more attention, but also like it's only in your best interest to help promote. Like, if you say that you're looking for a team and we write an article that you're looking for a team, there's zero reason for you not to retweet that. Even if you think that you have your own contacts and you're like already scrimming with people, maybe there's an organization that follows Dust 2 that doesn't follow you, and they're like, hey, maybe we'll build our roster around this guy. Anything can help, but it doesn't, like, I don't know how to get that through further to some of the players, right?
I wanna touch on one thing you said there about players like telling different things to different people. I want to tell you how the roster move that was made to cut the IGL on the team I coached in MDL. I was there for like 3-4 days and they were ready to cut the IGL. And I'm like, look, guys, terrible idea. Don't do this. Like, I really disagree that we should cut the IGL here. The analyst who had been there a while, but they had not too much sway. I think this is a terrible idea. Don't cut the IGL. So day 1, they want to cut one player. Day 2, they talk to me and they are 100% sure they want to cut another player. And then day 3, I wake up and they're like, yeah, we're cutting the IGL today. And it's like, what the fuck, guys? Like, what is going on in this fucking situation? Like, and this is a team that was like borderline playoffs, like 1 win away from playoffs a couple of seasons ago. I mean, MDL was in kind of shambles. There's a few teams that got forfeit losses, but 1 win away from playoffs. And it's a team that's couldn't even figure out who they wanted to cut for like 3. It's unbelievable how some of this stuff goes down. And I wish I had been there longer, because it was just like, you've been there for 3-4 days. The players bring you in. It's like, how do you really tell them, no, shut the fuck up, this isn't happening? It's like, well, you don't really have that yet,
Well, even the players themselves also kind of have this aura of having some leverage over you if they're the ones who requested that you be brought in anyway, and it's not something like a top-down org thing or where you were there from the beginning of the lineup or something like that, where like if we look to obviously a huge contrast, but if we looked at like Cloud9 with Kassad being announced pretty early on in that roster's formation, I don't think there's any questions as to who's got authority on that roster. It's not just the IGL or it's not just some of the players, but like Kassad was announced as part of like essentially like a star coach signing for that particular roster, whereas it completely changes the power dynamic in play with regards to the team itself. So I'm sure that had that must have contributed to it as well, and certainly not a good start to your coaching tenure with that organization. If the second you get in there, within a couple of days, there's talks of cutting multiple players, and then they decide to do completely go against what you said anyway. So
also, like, touching on Vu's point, is just that there's a lack of ability to have any conflict resolution with a lot of these teams and rosters. Like they have never been in a situation where they seem to like actually have to resolve conflicts with players, and instead of actually working through those issues and trying to build off of that, they're just like, no, we're gonna cut this like limb off and try and sew another one on, and they make a Frankenstein monster. So
I think that's huge. I think like actually I've mentioned it before, I think like almost kind of the embarrassment of riches, where it's just like you have so many options. It's like there's so many people we could pick up. We'll just cut this guy, get someone else, we'll replace him. Whereas like I feel like if you look at the Danish tier 2, like the Danish scene, right? You have this is your options. You're making it work. You've got a good amount of options in Denmark, but you look at some of these smaller scenes. It's like you have to make it work with what you got, right? Whereas here in NA, it feels like we can just cut someone tomorrow, pick up someone else, fix the issue immediately.
Also, it's a bit of a harder comparison when you do that, though, because the Danish tier 2 scene has a lot more organizations. And players are actually tied to salaries and buyouts and whatnot. So it does make it a little bit harder to make those player cuts.
So I just mean smaller scenes in general, especially back before there was a lot of organizations and it was, a little bit less. But yeah, you're right.
No, that's actually a fair point about the whole organizational thing, because it feels like if you look at a lot of these smaller regional scenes in Europe, if you go back a couple of years, they kind of looked like what NACS has looked like, but NACS doesn't seem to have gotten past some hurdles. And I think a lot of these things, like I follow Tolkien fanatic Joe Cardelli. I'm sure most of you guys are, if not all of you guys, are familiar with him. So the reason why I bring him up is because he's pretty consistently been tweeting out stuff like, he's not convinced that the issues have anything to do with Valorant or have anything to do with, the lockdowns from the pandemic. They don't have anything to do with the like ESL or anything like that. And I'm sure that's a more like I'm removing a lot of nuance from some of his points. But while those things have their part to play, it's not like they were the major root causes, right? A lot of them seem to be, in his eyes, player mentality issues. And maybe, to what Davey was saying earlier as well, like venture capital and these crazy investments coming in that sort of encouraged those irresponsible player decisions themselves. So bearing in mind that we've laid out a lot of our sort of concerns, we've talked about a lot of the problems that in our personal opinions plague the scene. Is there, like, in an attempt to sort of create a hierarchy here, does it all come, like, is it all downstream from a specific set of root causes? Like, do you guys think that if the players were able to change something about the way that they behave, that their conduct would help to shape a better, scene in the future? Is that like where we need to start? Or do we need to start at an organizational level? Like, how do we sort of go about actually trying to triage the issues here so we can try to fix them? Anybody got any ideas on this particular point?
I will say, just in general, I think it does all stem from the crazy the crazy investments that came into the scene. I think that's where it started. Now, there's a world where things are managed properly from that point, and it ends up becoming, it just goes up instead of, you know what I mean? Like, there was a world where that becomes a good thing and not a bad thing, but unfortunately, mismanagement from a lot of orgs and bad player decisions and a ton of factors made it so that wasn't the case. But going back to sort of your question, like, it will always be a mentality problem within North America, because whether or not Americans realize it, you are raised very differently in America than to people in Europe. The mentalities that are instilled in, let's say, in a lot of North Americans is very different. I think it's the same reason why in Europe you can have a 17-year-old kid who decides to take a year off school to pursue being a pro Counter-Strike player. But in America, that you would have to have very, very unique parents for that to even be considered or allowed, right? It's like, no, you have to go to college. You need to have a job when you're in high school, right? Because everyone needs to get a job when you're a teenager, because you need to learn what it is to make money. You need to learn what it is to have a job, responsibility. You know what I mean? So like the overall, the cultural difference between the two is very distinct between Europe and the United States. It is massively different in a lot of micro ways, which I know it sounds a little bit contradictory, but because overall I think Western culture is fairly similar in a lot of things, but the micro things that go on are very, very different between Europe and North America. And I think that is sort of what breeds a very difference in scenes, like that huge difference between the two scenes.
One of the things that I'm immediately struck by when I consider that particular angle too is that something I see often from the NA pros, the up and coming semi pros that I do follow on Twitter, is I have seen a bit of a tendency to complain or just sort of wallow in the fact that their scene is in the state that it is, and maybe they don't have solutions or.
Or even like potentially good upcoming semi-pros that get into FPL, and then instead of using that as a leapfrog to try to get onto a pro team, let's use FPL to make as much money as we can.
Yeah.
Right?
There's like a grifter mentality.
There's
almost
a completely different mentality of, in EU, if you get into FPL, it's like, finally I get to play with really good players and potentially get onto a pro team. In North America, a lot of the players get into FPL, it's like, nice, I can finally make some money. You know what I mean?
We could even draw a parallel between that.
From
Go ahead, Vu.
I wanted to ask if you think that stems from the players themselves, or do you think that, because I feel like if you get to a certain point in Europe, you can expect some direction. You can have someone like you mentioned, Ocean, you can have like Hunden. Whereas I feel like in North America, I'm not sure there's that direction you can really get. You think it's the players coming in that aren't seeking it, or it's the upper echelon that's not giving it?
I think it's the players coming in that aren't seeking it, because even back in the day, 3-4 years ago, new players would come into FPL and Steeler Days would rage at them and they would argue with them and then get kicked out a month later. Be like, oh, they just kicked me out because they don't like me. It's like, no, they kicked you out because a player who's way better than you was telling you were doing something wrong and you argued with them instead of just saying, yes, my bad. Like it's a completely different. Yeah, it's just a completely different mentality. Just completely different mentality. Like players, like and this is one thing. Like and then look what's happened. All the best players stopped playing FPL in North America because they were tired of these fucking bad players in comparatively to them, right? Like I'm not saying he did this. I'm just going to use him as an example because he's one of the best players in North America. You take a Liege playing in FPL, right? And then let's say current DAVEY, like my current skill level, I'm 18 years old and I qualify for FPL. And I go in there and Elijah is telling me, dude, you shouldn't have peaked that. I was like, well, I peaked it because this is this, and I thought this is right. And he's just like, this is just annoying now. Like, if you're Elijah, it's just annoying to have players like that who are in your games fucking up constantly. You try to tell them that they're fucking up, and then they argue with you. It's like, why am I here? Why am I playing this? I don't need this. You know what I mean? Like, I just played 8 hours of scrims, high stress, like very intense scrims in a professional environment. And now I'm going to sit here to try to play more Counter-Strike, and I'm getting some 18-year-old arguing with me. It's like, I can't be bothered with this shit. Like, I'm just not going to play anymore. And that's what happened. And in Europe, that doesn't happen, because in Europe, I've played EU FPL, completely different. If somebody like, even if it's somebody like Olaf, who's maybe not that great anymore, if Olaf's telling somebody they fuck something up, people don't argue with him. It doesn't matter. Even if you think he's wrong, you don't argue with him. You just sit there, like, you just don't say anything. It's better to not say anything. Sometimes you don't have to argue with people. You know what I mean? So I think that's one main, again, it's a huge cultural difference that makes such a big difference to how the two scenes are.
Also, touching on like the incentive of playing FPL for money, like, to me that just stems from like a very broken like infrastructure from the beginning. So like, if you take it from what Davey was saying at the start, with the organizations pumping in this VC money and offering these ridiculous salaries, when you're doing that and you have nobody to actually look over these teams, these players are not doing anything other than playing the game. Like, there's no incentive for them to do media interviews. There's no incentive for them to grow their own brand, really. You were said like there was some contract bonuses, but like, you're also scrimming and practicing and playing officials all the time. Like, you're not going to be that committed if you're already getting paid an inflated salary for where you're at to do the extraneous stuff, right? But so first of all, you're getting paid that ridiculous sum of money, and there's no incentive to do like any of the extraneous stuff. So you never build up those skills, first of all. Second of all, then you have something come in like FPL, which is offering $40,000 a month just for North America. $40,000 a month, $10,000 a week for these players to play in league, to play in FPL, and then in league, it's the prize pool is $30,000 for a 3-month long league. Like, the incentive structures to play in pugs versus play and actually take time to practice with your team are just extremely skewed. And when you have something like that, you have no, like, these organizations are not making money off of FPL money. They're also not making money off the MDL prize pool. And most of it probably goes to the players, like 70, 80% for most contracts, I think, if not more. And then you have all of these organizations not actually picking up any of these teams. And once you have that structure set up, then you have let's say you have a Sean Garris or a Nitro or a Nothing or a Steel. Like, when these players lose their pro contracts, or they are no longer on a team like Cloud9, where are they going to go, right? There's no organizations that are willing to fill that salary gap where it's like you're not quite pro or you're not top of pro anymore. There's nobody pay you the salary that's above MDL but just below top pro, right? And so why would these players stay when Sean Garris can go and make videos on himself? He has a kid to take care of. He can go like cast Valorant now. You have Nothing, who has like his own brand that he actually built up and can do his own stuff with, right? So when you have none of these experienced players coming down to actually help these younger players come up, then you're also screwing your whole like bottom up league structure, because these players are not getting like any of the actual experience from the top pros anymore, because they're not playing FPL and they're not playing league.
I think the FPL thing is kind of overstated in that, like, the incentive structure. I mean, you had guys like Steel. I remember Steel left Dynamic because they weren't taking it seriously enough. The best team in North America in Source by a lot. He left in his own words. I don't know what behind the scenes happened. He didn't think they were taking it seriously enough for no fucking money. No, there was no money back then. You went to ESEA LAN, first place, $5,000, and everyone knew Dynamic was winning first place, so you were going to ESEA LAN to come second at best, which was like $2,000, I think. People still went. People still tried their hardest. I think the incentive thing is a little bit overblown, because you're always going to have extra money for other stuff that you can do. However, I think Davey has a point that with the NA mentality, where it's like you have to prove to your parents this is worth money. I can make a living doing this. So you go to FPL and it's like, look, I can make money. I don't have to do school, whatever. I think the thing that's really big is that gap that Note you mentioned between pro and not pro, where that gap gets filled, by Ocean, for example, but it doesn't get filled by someone like Well, it got filled by Steel, but it doesn't get necessarily filled by someone like Steel all the time, or unless they're just super passionate. Someone like Sean Garris, where they go down and they really nurture the guys coming up. And then when you don't have that, like, nurturing, you don't have players that believe they can go from semi-pro to pro. So they just stagnate. And then they go, well, I can make more money in FPL anyways. Well, I can throw a game and make more money anyways.
Yes.
I'm not going pro. Why not? I think that's the real gap that needs to be filled to solve the NA problem.
Just touching on your search topic quickly, like the incentive to play in those was very different though, because back then people were playing for like a passion for the game. They wanted to win. Like that was a championship mentality from someone like Steel, right? I don't see that in a lot of players now. Like, where's that championship mentality gone?
I think that's what you
they don't have it because
they're
exactly, they don't have it. And so when you have it's sort of a combination, right? When you don't have the championship mentality and you have this easy route to making money just by playing solo, you're never going to get those players on the rise in a league structure.
Or even if you have both, like let's say you have a championship mentality, but you also really want to make money, and winning a championship is like so far in the fucking future you can't even like comprehend it, versus, or I could just play a bunch of pugs, which I was going to do anyways, and make a whole bunch of money. It's like, well, then all of a sudden, then this instead of it being like this, you have both of them. Then the one starts going down, and down, and then it becomes you don't even care anymore about this anymore. It's like gone now, right? And I think that's obviously a huge problem. Whereas in Europe, I'm sure there is players that are like that. There's people like that everywhere. But I'm just saying it's not as widespread of a. I guess we can call it an issue because it's an issue for the Counter-Strike scene here, but it's not as widespread of an issue over there. And I think the big thing that over there that players don't have over here is just overall, players here have a very large lack of respect for players who have accomplished more than them in the game. And that's something that when I was coming up in the scene, even if I thought I was better than somebody, if they had been playing pro for a while, or they had actually like won something or accomplished something, you show them a certain level of respect no matter what. And that is just completely gone from the NA scene. Over the past few years, I've seen some of the most ridiculous shit. It's just like, how do you have the balls to say that to him? Like, where I'll be sitting there just like in an FPL game, and some guy's like arguing with Steel, and I'm sitting there like, how do you have the balls to say this to him? Like, where is this confidence coming from? Like, how are you? Like, I just can't believe it. Sometimes it's like, what the fuck is going on? And like that was always so shocking to me. It was always so shocking. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, at least Simple had the decency to be a god when he was shit talking. Like, come on. These
right,
NA players have to step up.
If you're gonna become Simple, go for it, man. But like, and then at least be consistent.
Well, isn't that kind of the thing though? Like, I said it in jest, but a lot of the players seem to think that they could potentially become Simple. I mean, at least that's what they're. If you follow their talk,
alert, none of you
spoiler
can.
alert, none of you are being Simple.
No.
But the idea that
and if you can, you won't have to tell everybody you will.
Of course, yeah. Well, it's like that sort of projection thing. They're trying to sort of talk the talk, maybe. I'm just spitballing here because obviously I'm not anywhere close to even as good as those guys are. But the idea that they're going to come in and sort of have the ego aspects like full display, and despite the fact that they haven't really backed anything up, and they're talking to people who have backed it up. They're talking to people who have won championships or gotten highly placed at tournaments with some of the best teams in the world. Just the idea that you're going to have that disparity, that disrespect that Davey was talking about. That does seem like it's going to undermine any attempt to actually improve as a team or improve as a scene even.
And players remember that shit. Like, everybody in that game will remember that player having done that to Steel, and they're like, I'm not playing with him. That just is the reality of the situation. Players do remember things like that.
I mean, let me put it this way, Pernoga. You have as much of a chance of being the next Simple as most of these players in MDL do.
Well, it sounds like I'm on the right track then. I can't wait for it to happen.
I think, in my opinion, I actually think like this NA is dead type of, like, just the talk of it is kind of insidious in itself, because I think the idea that you can't go pro is an idea that I don't think MDL players should have, because that's when throwing comes in. That's when nobody cares anymore. It's when the idea really becomes in your mind, like, I can't do it. It's not going to happen. I put 15,000 hours in. It's not going to happen. So what do I do next? I go farm FPL. I throw some games. I don't really give a fuck, right? And I think when we're talking about ESL lowering the size of Pro League and muddying the waters of getting into Pro League, I think that's really caused extra issues in people thinking they can't go pro. And there are some talented players that I know of that have got the idea, I'm not going pro in CS, let's start throwing. And it's kind of sad because I think the reason they do that is because they don't think they can make it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to extend that conversation over to that section of the sort of like the verboten topic itself, where the idea that you're going to have these people who are going to be throwing at the semi-pro level. And just to what Vu says, it's disheartening to see that when you know how good they are, because when they have thrown the one game of the best of 3 that they're supposed to lose to rig the odds, afterwards they just spank them on the next 2 maps and it's not even close. Like, they clearly have the talent to actually win these games easily. They clearly have the talent to be better and higher up than they are, if they're even a little bit driven, you know? And the fact that they're sort of languishing, wasting it away for whatever reason, either because of broken infrastructure or because they've lost hope. You know, whatever the case may be, maybe they don't have the champions mentality. Maybe they've just, like, I think it extends past grifting for FPL money. It goes, when you get to throwing, it's because you probably just have decided, I'm never going to be able to play at a major. I'm never going to be able to do any of this, especially when the sort of, like Richard Lewis talks about this a lot, when the only punishment seems to be that for a long period of time, potentially forever, you're never going to be allowed at Valve sanctioned events. But there's still so many other tournaments out there in theory. I mean, not right now.
Arrests. We legit, I think we need some arrests. Like, when that happens, you might see some real shit.
Pernogo, you say they have the skill, but I've heard stories of like one team streaming their radar to the other team so that they can make like reads and outstack or like outpositioned teams just so that they can win the map and rig the odds and rig the outcome.
Yeah.
Like, when you're getting to that point and you're live streaming your radar to the other team over Discord during a match, like, get them out, man.
Yeah.
Get them out, get them arrested, find them. Like, how is this still happening?
Well, also incredibly stupid because both of the anti-cheats you would be using have full kernel access to your PC and can absolutely see that you were doing that. So you're just absolute morons if you've done that. You're incredibly dumb. And if they do actually decide to pursue that, you will get caught. And
I think some people have been asleep at the wheel to some extent, because I've seen people talk to me about games that are obvious, unbelievably obvious. Like, I've seen games, I saw a game on Mirage. I'm not going to leak names, but I saw a game on Mirage. They were rotating off the B bomb site at 145, stacking a CT side when a team was setting up, like, before anything else happened on the map. It's like, dude, something's fucked up here. Like, someone's asleep at the wheel to not investigate this. And if they've got kernel access, see that this dude was just streaming to someone else. Like, this is bullshit, you know? I feel like someone's been asleep at the wheel, and you know, I think ESIC wasn't around in this specific game I'm thinking about. I think they came around a little bit later, but you know, I think there needs to be more money. ESIC needs more funding so they can go after this type of shit.
Well, that's the other thing too, is that I think it's uncharted territory for them to even be dealing with law enforcement, which is what they've had to do, I think, in the Australian side of things, but also presumably the reason the MDL match fixing in NA has taken so long to sort of bear fruit in terms of their investigation is probably because of the fact that they're cooperating with law enforcement, which, I mean, Richard Lewis has been the prophet of doom for this particular side of things. The people who are doing it really got to stop now, if they are still doing it at this point, because, I mean, they might have already dug their own graves, but certainly don't keep adding dirt to your coffin afterwards. You know what I mean? Like, this is just getting ridiculous.
No, I had sent like a ton of info on match fixers and specific games that were being fixed. Sent it to ESEA 2 years ago, probably. Sent it to Richard, sent it to ESEA, sent it to a bunch of people. Nothing ever came of it until ESIC rolled around. That was the only time I ever heard anything being done about it. And I was like, guys, like, this is, here you go. Proof.
Yeah, silver platter stuff.
But yeah, here you go. Nothing. Didn't hear a word. Not a peep from anyone. Didn't hear anything. I'm like, how? Like, how is this still going on?
So here's the problem, is that from what I gather, these players are using like betting websites that are untraceable. Like, they're betting in Bitcoin on sites that are refusing to like comply with ESIC's investigations. Like, they didn't comply with ours. So like, what is it that we can possibly do in that case? If we're getting refused access, it's an untraceable Bitcoin. Like,
they had a Discord server. They did it in a Discord server.
These people
That's
are so
how.
Is this 2 years ago or now?
2 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
That is how dumb they were.
That's really dumb.
Well, like, Tencent has their info at least.
And people who I knew were sending me screenshots from this Discord server. And I'm just like,
yeah. Well, and the
ESEA
other thing
client, hello? Like,
dude,
this is happening at MDL. You have, like, I couldn't believe these
people are so dumb that they want to show that they can win. So when they throw, like a lot of these guys, they like sit and spawn. They run it their opponents backwards, and it's like there's proof, and also you can just watch the game, and it's like, well, now we know where to look, and it's unbelievable how dumb they have been about it to not yet have been, at least as soon as the first person ends up behind bars, I think you see a difference in the way that things are run, or
even just a huge fine. Like, dude, imagine forcing some 19-year-old who threw MDL games and made like 50 grand. Imagine forcing him to pay like 150 grand. It's like, or you can go to jail for 6 months.
I don't think
a
fine is enough.
Fine.
I don't think a fine is enough.
You don't think making a 19-year-old be in 150 grand of debt is enough to make people not want to do that?
Not for some of these guys, man. You see, come on, you're talking about players talking in a Discord about fixing matches. You think these players have these people who are fixing matches have the
a lot of the people who were in it weren't even actual players. They were just people who knew the players that were just setting everything up.
That's how my power got caught.
Just think how long this has been happening, though. Like, maybe some of these players have that sort of money, right? Like, you don't know. Maybe. The thing is, like, when you get slapped with something like jail time, then you're actually like, oh shit, this means something. I don't think a fine is enough at this point with the scale and the length at which this has been happening.
Yeah,
like something more severe needs to happen.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a judge. I'm not going to be the one dealing out the punishments or anything, but I feel like, whatever the laws are in whatever respective state or country or whatever, I'm sure if they catch them having done it enough times, I'm sure jail time will be the appropriate punishment.
I think like scaling up the money is rough because people are still always going to look at it like money. Like, I'm making money, I get fined money. Even if it's a short jail time, even if they're in jail for 3 months, that is real fucking consequences. That is real shit, The
problem is, like, I'm super hesitant with how the jail system works in some countries to just like send 18-year-olds to prison. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's, although I do agree that they probably deserve it. It's still like that can cause a lot more problems than it fixes, for sure, especially in certain places.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea behind the on paper, the prison idea is, hey, that you've done something really fucked up. Here's something that's punishment so that you can show society that you have served a punishment for doing this. And in theory, this is supposed to stop you from doing it again. Like, recidivism isn't supposed to keep happening.
I'm supportive of a short jail sentence. You're sent to jail for like 2-3 months and you're banned from ESEA. And that's just like, you're banned from all the leagues and whatever. And that's just like, look, guys, this is real shit. You're going to get in trouble. It's like, you're not going to ruin your life, hopefully, right? But like, this is real shit, right? Like, I don't think you should be sending them to jail for 2-3 years. No, I don't know. It depends how bad they've done it, if they're like the ringleader or whatever. But I think a short but actual consequence is what is necessary to really make people realize, like, I could actually cause problems in my real life. Right now, online and real life, these are very separate things in most people's mind.
Especially right now.
Online. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm throwing online, but I'm going to be a doctor, right? And if it's like, I'm throwing online, I might not be a doc. Like, that's real consequences.
It's not even like the overall jail time. It's the fact that it's going to be on your record and it actually affects you in real life at that point. Yeah. That's the real draw to
the felony
even a short prison sentence. Exactly. Because you're defrauding people. Like, you're taking money away from other people. You're rigging an outcome of a match. It's like, it's very cut and dry in that sense. But I agree. It's like a lengthy prison sentence wouldn't be the way to go. But like something that actually has a dire consequence and actually shows these people that what they're doing is completely wrong and affects them going forward is important.
One of the things that I keep thinking back to when it comes to the whole throwing argument or the throwing discussion is obviously when Vu brought up the fact that these players oftentimes they still have their egos on full display. They must show that they actually could have won at any time, but instead they inexplicably started running backwards into their opponents. It just reminds me of the like constant no-scope attempts that were happening with the netcode guide's I by power throw, which like started this whole wagon train moving really for most people's money. Like, I just can't believe that this is still the same thing. Like, NACS sometimes just never changes. It seems they're always going to be trying up to their old tricks. It seems so. Like this is a case where it would actually behoove you to be a bit more intelligent about it and to actually be a bit like keep your ego in check for the sake of making money. But they you know, these players can't even seem to do that correctly in that sense. They have to sort of incorporate the fact that they think that they are going to be like, maybe not the next big thing because they're sort of deciding that they don't ever want to play in a major, or they're fine sort of sacrificing that potential honor. But what do you guys make of the whole, like, on the side of the players thing that we're talking about a hell to run away from with the prison sentences, but is there really even like a heaven to strive towards? Because Vu's talking about the idea that you have no opportunity. Like if you keep saying that NACS is dead, NACS is in a really bad spot, NACS might die, then there's going to be these people who just decide to use that as their excuse for why they're deciding, you know, why they're willing to stoop to the level of match fixing. So like at this point, is it as bad as people have been making it sound like? Is it really to the point where it actually is in danger? Or like, is this a situation where it's just going to enter into maybe a fallow year or something, and then, you know, we'll rise back up afterwards? Any takers on this subject?
I'll say this on this topic. There is a genuine vested interest from organizers, teams, HLTV, like the people behind the scenes to actually try and get us to bounce back. But when I go on Twitter and all these players are singing doom and gloom and actually not doing anything to try and help us bounce back, you're not going to help. Like, you're on one hand, I'm seeing players say that, oh, I don't want to go to Valorant. I prefer Counter-Strike. I would love to stay in Counter-Strike. But then they're going, oh, CS is dead. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. But there's so much you can do about it. You just have to actually genuinely have like the effort, put forward the effort, and actually be like, you have to get that championship mindset back as well. Like it's goes hand in hand, honestly.
I think we might be in for a kind of rough year. I think when it comes down to it, there will always be people that will show up and they love the game and they want to be really good and they're willing to put in the effort, even if pro CS might not be in the future, you know, even if they're not ever going to be a good player, they're willing to put in 10, 15,000 hours just to be good. And I think that will, you know, those players will rise up. But I think at the moment, you know, I think one thing that's not even talked about that often is that when you have orgs gambling on CS in 2015, 2016, raising the salaries, and they're still, like, I think most people would agree, they're still kind of gambling. They're looking at futures, right? And then Valorant comes around, they go, oh, look, way bigger upside. Like, you know, we could be the next NIP from CS, right? Like, just make, like, blow up in Valorant, right? They switch to Valorant just to gamble. Like, in my opinion, I think a lot of orgs are switching to gamble. Maybe you guys disagree. I think a lot of them are switching to basically just gamble on futures, and then a lot of them will come back in a year. And then when they come back and they see a scene that's like, there are people dedicated, trying to improve, trying to get better, I think there is, you know, a potential future, but I think it's going to take a little bit.
I think I agree with you in the sense that they're switching to gamble. I think that they know right now NA Counter-Strike is not profitable, and as far as, you know, game devs go, Riot has been one of the game devs that has proven they can make a profitable franchise league. EULCS, NALCS. Maybe Cloud9's not making profit this year, but they're a unique case, let's say. So generally, though, you can make profit in the LCS if you want to, right? So Riot, so because orgs recognize that Riot, it has this proven product of being profitable in esports, that's valuable. There is a few other games that are profitable, but they're not as big. Rainbow Six, Rocket League, games like that both have pro scenes that are profitable because the salaries are reasonable. The game devs actually pump money into the orgs to support the game. And so, you know, things like that do become profitable. And so I think that's, like you're saying, they're switching over to gamble. They hope that Valorant becomes the next Counter-Strike. Talked about this 100 times. Valorant will not become the next Counter-Strike for a multitude of reasons, so I don't need to go into that anymore. But I agree that orgs will start to come back eventually. When is tough because there's so many external factors that are going on right now with COVID, just the overall, you know, the American economy and COVID. You know, that makes it tough for orgs to want to come back and invest at the current levels. So I think what's going to happen is, like you were saying, NACS is going to have a rough time. It's going to have a rough time over the next year, maybe year and a half. Salaries are going to all come back down to being reasonable. The best pro teams are just going to stay in Europe. for a while, right? But like you were saying, the thing is that the North American market is so valuable that everybody, like Note was saying, will have that vested interest in making NACS successful again because of how valuable the region is from a merchandising marketing standpoint. NA is incredibly valuable. Everybody knows if you work in marketing, if you work in esports, the American demographics are the most valuable ones. If you have 18 to 30 North American male, if that's your demographic, that is the most valuable one. That's the one all the sponsors want. So that is why at some point they will come back and NACS will make its comeback, but it is going to be a rough few years. There's no doubting that. It might be 1 year, it might be 2 years, and rough might just be people aren't making $10,000 to just be in pro league anymore. You know what I mean? Like that might be what rough is now. We might go back to early 2016 level salaries where you might make $3 to $4 grand to play in pro league now, right? Like, and that'll be rough for a lot of people who aren't used to that. But overall, it's not as doom and gloom as people make it out to be. And Valorant will slowly go down in popularity.
Also, to touch on the Valorant topic, like a lot of these players are very much underestimating like their longevity in that game. I think they're bouncing because right now it's a good opportunity, but the Overwatch League has a very good chance. Like it's likely going to die very fast if it's pretty much already on death's door. When you have those players who are so used to an FPS with abilities come over to something like Valorant, they are going to be shitting on a lot of these CS pros. Like maybe not the top players who have actually like been putting in a lot of effort, but a lot of the ones who just switched and actually don't grasp like the more like in-depth mechanics of the game. Like you're going to have a massive disparity between those players and the CS ones. Also, like Maui Snake replied to me in a tweet a while ago, and it just like
who?
Maui Snake.
Oh, okay.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him.
Kind of rude, man. It's kind of fucked up.
These toxic NA fucking players.
It's not my fault. I don't know.
Unreal. Look at this man's ego. It's so.
It's not my fault. I don't know who he is.
He basically like he made a very good point that a lot of the Valorant character abilities sort of provide an avenue for these North American players to sort of escape some of the issues they have when it comes to playing CS. Like he said something like bad in a bad position, jet dash out. Don't forgot a smoke lineup and cover going out. Like a lot of this stuff is like stuff that players were not good at. Like you look at Obo, he went to complexity and Blame F is still like remembering half the smokes for him and throwing them anyway. Like remembering these sort of like micro things in the game is stuff that North American players were just notoriously bad at because they don't put in that server time and effort. So when you have something like Valorant that allows you to make up for those things with characters and abilities, then you're going to be compensating for that. But eventually when that meta develops far enough, you're still going to struggle. Like
I do think there will be Overwatch players that come over and are pretty good, but I don't think the vast majority of them will be. Because like you have to remember too, there's a lot of Overwatch players who like play tank, guy who sits there and puts a shield. Like I know this is very generalized, but like, I'm just saying there is a lot of players who don't play DPS. Most of the players on an Overwatch team don't actually play the damage dealers. And there's only a certain amount of damage dealers that are what they call like hit scan, which is like somebody like Soldier or McCree, where you point, you shoot, and then the bullet hits, right? There's a lot of DPSs that aren't like that. And it's actually like things that like shoot out like
projectiles.
Projectiles, right? Yeah. So I don't think it's going to be as clear cut as you think of how a whole bunch of Overwatch players are going to come over and all of a sudden be shitting on all the CS players that have been playing the game for months. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case at all. I think there will be a few who come over and take spots, but I don't think it's going to be as widespread as you think.
I don't think it's going to be a longevity issue. I think CS players will definitively have a longevity issue regardless, though, especially if they spend a long time with CS. Riot loves patching stuff right before tournaments. They love just changing shit on the fly. They absolutely adore adding more microtransactions. I mean, champions. I mean, reworking champions to make them OP. I mean, making new exciting options for their players. They love all of this stuff. It drives their revenue. It's pretty much the only reason why, like one of the main reasons why their main games are successful. So the idea that they're not going to do the same thing with Valorant. I mean, they're already releasing new operators or whatever whatever they're called, agents, I guess. Yeah, they're all already releasing more of them. There's like another one coming soon, I guess. So there's a series of events that's going to transpire where the game is just consistently going to change, and that tests a very different skill set than what Counter-Strike players are used to. They're used to adapting to like maybe other people's strategies within the same maps, or very occasionally a new map or a slight change to a new map or an existing map, but they're not going to be used to like fundamental ways that change how the game is interacted with based on your team composition. They're not going to be like the equivalent would be like having a weapon that completely changes how you interact with grenades or something in Counter-Strike. That just doesn't happen. There's nothing like that.
Creek.
Yeah. Okay. Well, aside from situations where
the creek changes like the meta in the game, but not like the way
not how the
everything else
nades
gets
interact.
dealt with,
You know, that's the only comparison. But yeah, I agree.
No, yeah.
I wanted to add one thing about the switching to Valorant thing before we go off that topic or before we move on. Is I feel like a lot of people are like a lot of change is because people don't see a future where they can go pro in CS because they feel like you stagnate, and I think a lot of people do feel like there's a bit of an old boys club type of situation, even if there is or isn't, and specifically because you have I'll name guys like Floppy. 11 seasons in MDL, and then he goes on Cloud9 and he's fucking nuts. Like how long was he good?
Well,
how long was he good before he got on, before he's been recognized as being good? That's the question. Like maybe a few seasons, right? I would argue maybe a few seasons. You have guys like Drone switch to Valorant. He's always been a pro, but kind of like a fringe pro, right? I don't know if he's ever been on like one of the top team in NA, and he's on the top team in NA and in Valorant. I feel like people just see a potential future. Then Valorant's going to change. I think Riot loves adding agents that change the way the game was played, and then they're going to want to go back.
Yeah. Oh, that's another thing to consider.
If they don't make the jump.
Yeah. If they're not able to really stick it in there, or if they, after maybe even a year or 2 years of playing, they eventually get to the point where they can't hack it at the whatever regional locked leagues Riot ends up implementing, most likely. Because that's another format discussion that we haven't even thought about when it comes to this sort of topic within our show. But Valorant presumably will follow a similar approach to LCS, considering that's what's proven to be profitable now. Like they recently announced that
said
LCS
they
is gonna
won't.
be
They said they won't originally, right? But I think anybody who knows anything about Riot knew that was never the case.
Davey, what do you think about Floppy? What was the well?
You said until we found out Floppy's nuts. I'm like, by what metric?
Well, I just mean like surely there was a few seasons where he could get things done and he could be on a pro team, but he was still sitting in MDL. That's what I really mean by
I think that was by choice though. I think if you have the choice between, if you're flopping, you have a choice between being on a low level pro team or trying to win MDL with people who you like. I think he just made a conscious choice to choose to keep playing in MDL. I don't think like he could have went and played on a low level pro team, but I think he chose to keep playing with people who he likes in MDL and try to actually win MDL instead.
All right, but yeah, maybe that's something I wasn't privy to that information. Yeah, I think there are players like I think Drone's a decent example. I don't know, maybe.
Well, Drone played for like 2 or 3 years in a pro team.
Yeah, well, because he was always a fringe pro. That's what I mean, right? Like he was a pro, but he was like never on Liquid or those top teams. And then he goes to Valorant and he's like, I haven't watched Valorant very much, but I've seen people talk about him as like one of the best players in Valorant, if that's the case,
Probably is. Yeah, no, he was always really good mechanically. He was just never good enough to make the jump from just being a pro to being a really good one.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is bros Valorant, before pros, Davey.
But in Valorant, but in Valorant, it's like you're one of the first people to switch over, and you're really mechanically skilled. One of the best players in the world now. That's just how it is in Valorant. It's the same thing, way back. How long was Get Right the best player in the world for? Right, like maybe a year and a half, 2 years when CS:GO came out. Get Right was just the best player in the world. Everybody accepted it. He also was one of the best players in the world in 1.6 as well. But lots of people didn't switch over right away to CS:GO. So the people who did, they were the best players in the world. If you were really, really good at the previous form of Counter-Strike, switch over to CS:GO, you're one of the best players in the world. Shocks, Kenny S, Get Right, Forrest, all those players early on in CS:GO were all the best players, right? So, and then, eventually people start more and more people start coming in and they start taking over. But I will say, I don't think Valorant will have that longevity, let's say.
Yeah, there's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people are looking back at history to draw examples, and then somebody else is like, "Well, it's different this time because it is different because I said so. That's why."
Yeah,
it's like, all right, well, I guess you're doomed to repeat it after all, then.
Yeah.
So we're coming towards the end of the show. I want to get people's like sort of final thoughts, sort of get a read on the room, what everybody's thinking now. It seems like we were coming towards a conclusion that with Valorant sort of out of the way eventually, there's going to be a resurgence. Maybe people who aren't banned for match fixing anyway, that are off in Valorant currently, are going to end up trying to make it back in CS once they can no longer hack it in Valorant, or once they just grow disillusioned with the game, because CS is it's a hard game to top in terms of how fun it actually is, even if you are a pro. So obviously that's another consideration to think of, especially once the scene allows for a little bit more sustainability, we'll say. So it looks like people are somewhat optimistic after we get through maybe a rough year, like we were saying earlier. So just going around, I'll start back with you, Davey, since we started with you at the beginning of the show. Your sort of predictions or projections. What do you expect out of this year? And is NACS really not dead? Is it going to come back?
I think yes. CS it'll just never die. It is the everlasting esport. It will continue forever. But I think that it's going to be a rough year. Obviously, I think how fast the recovery is depends on how fast. I know it sucks to have to talk about it because this is a Counter-Strike show, but however fast COVID gets resolved will be how fast the NA scene recovers just in general. I think that that is it's a crucial point that right now in North America, people don't want to put their money into things that are gambles as much anymore. People still want to gamble, but they see a Riot FPS as less of a gamble than a Valve FPS, because Valve doesn't give in their minds, Valve doesn't give a fuck. I'll tell you, from talking to multiple org owners, trying to get them to sign CS teams, or from them asking me like, hey, I want to sign this Valorant team. Do you know any of these players? What are their personalities like? I know they used to play Counter-Strike, right? Talking to all of them, they're like, yeah, no, Valve fucked it. There's just no sustainability in CS. Valve needs to get involved sooner. That's what they all say. So that's, so really what it comes down to it is how soon COVID gets fixed, is the sooner the NA scene gets fixed. It won't die. It's not going to be dead. People are still going to play. There's still going to be a scene, but it is going to be a rough year for a lot of players in the tier 2 and tier 3 side of it. You're not going to be making thousands of dollars a month to play Counter-Strike anymore.
No, you look like you had something to say there.
Well, I mean, you have these orgs and org owners saying that Valve fucked it, but they're the same org owners who pumped VC money and massively inflated the salaries and created the situation we're sort of in now too. So it's a little bit hypocritical in that sense. They are. They're doing the exact same thing in Valorant.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I'm not saying they're right. Yeah. I'm saying that's what's all in their mind.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not all, but a few of them. And I will say some of them I've talked to didn't actually pump in any VC money, but it doesn't really matter.
Fair. But yeah, other than that, I do see, like Davey said, I think I do see NACS bouncing back after we're able to actually travel more and hold lands again. One thing I pitched to ESEA and ESL is like to somehow have their circuit focus more on like local events, like local lands. So having like a monthly cash cup that qualifies you for like, I don't know, a Philadelphia or like some sort of Nerd Street Gamers like local event where they can actually like ESEA has some part to play in it where they fly you out or whatever. Like some form of like created circuit that's dedicated to North America that allows these players to get a little bit more experience. Just because you have that in Europe, but you don't really have it here as frequently. So I think that would be a major benefit, and I hope to see that come up next year.
I think that would be great.
Yeah. And on top of that, hopefully like there'll be some changes to like league structures or like, in general, some different changes coming to like the way stuff is run. And with that, like I said in the podcast with Launders, I can't emphasize it anymore that there really needs to be a drive coming from the players to make a genuine like vested interest in helping improve the scene as well, because I can tell you right now that there are many people actually interested in helping it bounce back, but you guys are just as much of a part of it as we are, and you have to be like the critical focus behind helping drive that forward, essentially.
I think Note really hits it on the head with a lot of that stuff. I think having a return to some more local events is really big. I heard I wasn't around in the scene at the time, but I heard the economic crisis in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008 had a big effect on NA because there used to be a lot of local NA events, and after that, it felt like everything was kind of gone. I don't know if Davey you were around at that time, but Davey might have some input on that, which you kind of lost a lot of those local events. Were you around at that time, Davey?
I wasn't playing competitively at the time, but I was watching a lot of CS at the time, and I was playing I was playing in open and stuff like that. But I was like literally 12 years old, so not I wasn't super involved. But yeah, no, there was two big events back in the day that fucked NACS for a while: CGS collapse and the economic crash of 2008. Right? Was it 2008 economic crash?
So, yeah.
I don't even know.
I think it was.
Yeah.
The 2008 economic crash. So those two events, like pretty much back to back, almost completely like shut down pro level CS. Not completely, but like they fucked pro level CS like it is right now in NA for like a year pretty much. And then every time it just recovers because the economy recovers and people want to start taking their investment gambles, making their money, doing whatever. And so, all the sponsors want the American markets because people are spending money again. And as we know, Americans 18 to 30 spend the most money out of any demographic in the world. So that's the demographic everybody wants. And so it always does bounce back. It always will recover. The main difference this time is you're gambling on the fact of will Valorant take a whole bunch of those people away. That's the difference this time. Is back then there was never a real competitor, so that could be the one difference that this time has a more lasting effect than previously. Personally, I don't think they will, but that's a matter of opinion at that point.
I think I don't know. I think us is like we're so involved in the pro scene. It's hard for us to like really look at what makes a game good. I think Valorant could do very well. I think games that cater to the more casual audience, which is exactly what Valorant wants to do. I feel like Valorant wants to use professional players to give some like validity to their scene. But what they really are is they want to make sure that players can come to Valorant and they can play from MOBA, they can come from Overwatch, whatever. It's not as hard to enter as CS, and I think that could be a big deal long term. But I do think like CS should bounce back to some extent. But I think a focus on smaller events is really good to get people into it, to get people active in their communities, to find players, stuff like that. I think local events are really important, which is when COVID kind of resolves, hopefully we can get some more of that. Having smaller stuff like qualifications from cash cups to lands and stuff like that, where players can start to feel like, oh, I won this cash cup, I actually have a future. Maybe this can turn into something. And then Note's right as well with players. I've talked to a good amount of players and they all have a very doom and gloom look at it. Like the ones I've talked to, it's all like, we can't, like, who's even good to pick up? Like, I only know a few people. Everyone, like, it's all very doom and gloom, which is like, you're kind of creating your own problem with that if you constantly think that way.
I think if we're gonna talk about Valorant, and I guess now it's been brought up, so I guess I'll go on my Valorant rant, I guess, again. The thing that will make Valorant or the problems that Valorant will have are the same problems that Overwatch has. It's the same problems that MOBAs have. It's the same problem that all games that are ability based have. Is that there's a couple things. First of all, a lot of the player base, you talk about casual player base, a lot of the casual player base has no interest in watching the game competitively. They just don't. They might tune in randomly every now and then if they see it on, get bored, not really know what's going on, leave. It's super common. For League of Legends, they have this massive player base, but less than 1% of the player base actually watches the game. And especially watches the LCS, right? LCS numbers have been going down, player base apparently going up, right? Apparently. We don't actually know because they release their own numbers. They could just make shit up and nobody can hold them accountable, right? But that's apparently what's going on. So when you have a game like that where you have you in theory have such a high player base and you're hoping that because you have such a high amount of players, enough of the casual players will be interested in the competitive to make the competitive sustainable, right? That's the MOBA, and now the Valorant model, right? Darian, I know you're familiar with StarCraft, obviously.
Yes.
StarCraft has the same problem. If you don't play StarCraft, you can't watch StarCraft because it's a game that if you don't play it, if you don't understand what's happening, you can't watch it. So if you have those two things, which is what MOBAs have and Valorant has, where you have to play the game to understand what's happening, and then you also have to be interested in the competitive scene to want to watch it competitively. So casual players might not watch competitively, and if you don't play, you're definitely not watching competitively. So the actual people watching the game is a lot lower than the people playing and the people that are just watching games on Twitch. Because if you don't play Valorant, you're not watching Valorant on Twitch, right? So
I think you got a very good point with that. But I kind of disagree. I feel like StarCraft is like somewhat watchable. I know I got into StarCraft by watching it. CS is definitely watchable. Valorant, you're actually right. I think that's a really good point.
So you may have like watched StarCraft and been like, oh, this looks cool, I want to get into it, and then you get into it. But if you just sit there and watch StarCraft, I've watched StarCraft highlights where casters are screaming and freaking out. I'm just like, what are they excited about? Like, I don't know what they're excited
Sunken
about. You know what I
Colony.
mean? Whereas in Counter-Strike, you could have never watched Counter-Strike before ever, and you see, oh my god, a jumping double from Cold, and you're like, holy shit, he just like jumping no scopes that guy. You know what I mean? Like, you understand what's happening, even if you've never watched Counter-Strike before, you know what's happening, right? Whereas like I feel like so again, the thing that Counter-Strike has that none of the other esports have is they have an incredibly large viewer base of people who don't play the game.
Yes.
There's so many people who watch Counter-Strike that do not play it. Maybe they played it a long time ago. Maybe they've never played it. I met a guy at an airport one time who was sitting on a laptop watching a Counter-Strike event on his laptop. And I was like traveling around like as a pro Counter-Strike player at the time. And I walked by and I was like, oh, do you like Counter-Strike? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, well, and I asked him like, do you play? And he's like, no, I've never played before. I just like watching it. And it's like some 35-year-old, 40-year-old dude sitting at an airport watching Counter-Strike on his laptop. You know what I mean? And that's way more common than people think. It's something that people take for granted. The amount of people who I have in my streams, in my Twitch chats, who don't actually play Counter-Strike. They don't play. They just like watching. They just like watching Counter-Strike. And so that's one thing. And also, because of the nature of what Counter-Strike is, if you're playing matchmaking, even with your friends, it is naturally a competitive environment. Like, everything about it is like, it's more competitive. It's more serious, I guess I would say. You can make it fun, obviously. I'm not saying everybody who's playing is playing to win all the time, psychos, but like, it's just naturally a more competitive environment. So people who play Counter-Strike casually are more likely to watch the competitive scene than people who play League of Legends casually, people who play Valorant casually, because of the nature of what the game is. It's the same reason why 1v1 games have a very high casual player viewer like retention. I don't know what to call it, but like
crossover,
crossover, sure. Like StarCraft, like the fighting games, like I'm trying to think of another one that's a good example, but StarCraft and the fighting games are the ones that jump to my head right away. Is that because it's 1v1, it's like, it's so personal when you're playing against somebody else, because like, I am beating you, I am better than you or you beat me, you are better than me. It becomes so personal that it becomes naturally competitive. It brings out people's natural competitiveness. So that's the same reason why StarCraft blew up in Korea. I think it's been talked about quite a bit, but because so many people were playing StarCraft, so many people were watching competitive StarCraft, because there was a direct correlation in the 1v1 part of it. And so I think that's one thing that Valorant will not retain, and they won't have that. They won't have the viewer base of people who watch but don't play, which is crucial, I think, to Counter-Strike's success. But they also won't be retaining as many casual viewers as they hope to, because people who play the game think watching the game is boring. It's the same problem Overwatch had. You can play the game, and playing Overwatch is pretty fun. Even to this day, playing Overwatch can still be pretty fun with a group of friends, but watching Overwatch fucking sucks. And a lot of people who play Valorant casually, I know a lot of friends who I went to school with, people who I just know that aren't real, like, no, they're not hardcore gamers, but Valorant came out. They're like, oh, cool, a new sort of easier FPS, more fun FPS for me to play. And they play casually every now and then with their friends. And you bring up the name Drone, bring up the name Wardell. They don't even know who you're talking about. And they've been playing the game since release. So that's one problem that Valorant is going to have consistently. And I think they need to make significant changes to the actual way the game plays if they want to retain a lot more of those viewers that they're hoping to retain.
Yeah, well, even the people in my matchmaking games say that there's one get right, there's one Olaf, like they.
Yep.
Because that's just ingrained in their heads. So those people maybe they don't even watch Pro CS that much, but they know the call outs, right? So it's sort of They're primed for it already.
Know the players. If you're in any matchmaking game in North America, you type Stewie's name into the matchmaking game. Everybody knows who Stewie is. You know what I mean? Like it's just a completely different scene.
Yeah, I've never actually thought about it too much from that perspective, like the crossover between casual and you know, professional viewers. That's a very like good point, I think. Because it is especially when you have that much interactivity between the abilities in a game like Valorant, whereas like CS is like, it's a smoke, here's a molly, here's a nade. This is very clear cut.
And everybody's got the same app. Like, they can all do
exactly.
it.
And you learn it once and then you get it, right? And then you go into Valorant and it's like, well, how do these two things interact? What is he? It feels super chaotic. The couple of games I've watched, and I've had people trying to convince me to play it or to coach it, and I've just been like, dude, this game just doesn't like. I can't even watch the game. It just doesn't seem fun to me. And that's like, I'm the most likely person to do that because I've done it with StarCraft and with League of Legends. I watched the game, then I played it, right? That's what I did. And I just don't see it with Valorant, honestly. Like, I enjoyed it when I played it before. And one of my point about Valorant that I've made is that I think Riot has like taken over, and it's gone from this like, this is CS, but a little bit different, to like, we want to appease the new players. We want to appease the base, and you're adding characters that are like one-shotting you with an ability, or they're like doing some ridiculous shit, and that just adds to the complexity, which like takes away from the crossover effect as well.
Yeah, they're never going to make this problem that Davey was bringing up about the information gap that is between somebody who's just starting and somebody who's played the game for X amount of months, or years even. They're never going to make that problem easier. You know, they're only going to make it worse as they add more stuff. This is sort of what you were saying there. And since Davey brought up StarCraft, I don't even have to be the guy who shoehorns it into CS. I can actually piggyback off of that. And I will just say that we were talking about match fixing earlier. Match fixing, in many people's eyes, killed Brood War. But Brood War was actually still going after that match fixing. It was making a resurgence. And then Blizzard killed it twice somehow. And it's still here somehow, despite Blizzard's best efforts. Even the developer of the game couldn't do it. So you guys think Valve can do it? You guys think Valorant can do it? You guys think match fixing can do it? I think you're all wrong. I think it's still here to stay. So, and you know, that's obviously only in Korea too. Like, that's not to say nothing of any foreigners. So yeah, there's some sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, I suppose, some hope. I don't know if anybody's got any final words for us before we shut out, but I think it was a nice uplifting closing sort of chapter here to this show that you leave people with a little bit of hope towards going into the future for NA. What do you guys think?
Yeah. I think, like I said, I think NACS will eventually recover. So.
And CS players are too unique, man.
My dream world is that the casual viewer base watching Valorant are like, oh shit, look at this game called Counter-Strike. It's so much better than Valorant. We're going to go watch Counter-Strike instead.
Yes.
All right. It's going to put it in the contracts, man.
It's Counter-Strike player. Stop fucking streaming Valorant, dumbass.
Yeah.
Oh shit. This feels like a personal attack.
It's not that personal. Anytime I see a pro CS player just like streaming themselves playing Valorant, I'm like,
Is this going to be one of those spots where Riot tries to put it in the contract? You can't stream CS if you're a Valorant player. You're
fucking probably.
I like it in there. I like how Pernogo is like ending this on a nice happy note, like nice and encouraging. Davey's like, fucking stop streaming Valorant.
CS pro and you're streaming Valorant, you're just like, it's just kind of stupid, bro. Like, it's just kind of dumb.
It's true.
Just kind of dumb.
Well, there you go. Davey's own words. Don't be kind of dumb. Join us on the next one.
Kind of dumb.
See you guys later.